The first time I saw my child lying there on the sidewalk, in the freezing cold, like a shadow the whole city had forgotten. Something inside me shattered, in a way I knew would never fully heal again. It was a Friday night in February, right in the middle of a Minneapolis winter, the kind of winter where the cold doesn't just cut through the thickest coat you own, it slices straight into your bones. I had just gotten off the number 5 bus at the North Minneapolis stop, my hands still trembling slightly from the 15 below cold and from the exhaustion after an 8-hour shift at the hospital. All I wanted was to go home, make myself a hot cup of coffee, sit by the fireplace for a few minutes, and then go to bed. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary on the same 5-block walk I'd taken for the past 30 years. But that night, God had other plans for me. From a distance, I saw someone curled up between 2 cardboard boxes, in the dark corner squeezed between a closed convenience store and a donut shop that stayed open all night. No movement, no cry for help, just a shadow left behind in the wind and snow. At first, I thought it was a homeless person like so many who searched for shelter on the streets of Minneapolis every night. But something made me look again. Maybe it was the hair. Long, naturally curly, far too familiar for me to just walk past. Or maybe it was the way that person's arms were wrapped tightly across their chest, exactly the way my girl had always done since she was little whenever the weather turned cold. I started walking closer. Each step felt as heavy as stone. My heartbeat pounded so hard I could hear the rush of blood in my ears, and when I was less than 6 feet away, my world collapsed. It was my daughter. It was Samira Underwood. My baby girl was lying on a sidewalk as if she no longer had any worth in this world. "Oh, Lord," I whispered, my legs suddenly weak. "Samira, what are you doing out here?" I knelt down beside her, not caring that the icy concrete was cutting into my knees. That pain was nothing compared to what I was seeing. Her face was smeared with dirt. Her brown skin, once so radiant, was now grayish, dry, and cracked. Her lips were purple. Her clothes were torn in several places. One shoe was far too big, hanging loose. The other was nothing but a worn sole held together with duct tape. But what truly stopped my breath were her eyes when she opened them. They were no longer the eyes of the girl who had once been full of dreams, the girl who had cried tears of joy when she got accepted into nursing school, who had hugged me and said, "Mama, I did it." That night, in those eyes there was only emptiness, panic, and a pain so deep no words could describe it. "Samira, my baby, wake up," I said, placing my hand on her shoulder, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. She slowly opened her eyes, as if it took all the strength she had just to pull herself back into reality. Her gaze moved across my face, confused, afraid, ashamed, and finally, relieved. "Mom," she whispered in a hoarse voice, "why are you here?" I couldn't speak. My throat tightened as if someone had wrapped their hands around it. The tears I had held back for so many years finally spilled over, unstoppable. All I could do was hold her. Samira broke down crying in my arms, small, weak sobs, like she had been forced to swallow her tears for far too long. I stroked her messy hair, trying to understand how this could have happened. My daughter, the baby I carried for 9 long months, the child I sat up with through endless nights when she was sick, the little girl I taught to take her very first steps, was now sleeping on a sidewalk like some stranger the world had abandoned. "Come on, baby," I finally managed to say, though my voice shook. "Let's go home. You are not staying out here one more second." We stood up very slowly. Samira leaned against me, just like she used to lean on me during storms when she was little. She felt frighteningly light, a kind of light that wasn't normal. How hungry had she been? How many nights had she wandered like this? "Mom," she whispered again. "He left me. I don't have a single dollar to my name." Her voice cracked on the word he. And I understood everything. I didn't need another word to know who Samira was talking about. Deshaun Merrick, her husband, the man I had never fully trusted. The man she was always trying to defend. The man who had called me too controlling. The man who had sworn he would take care of her. And the man who had destroyed her life. But this was not the moment for questions. It was not the moment for blame. This was the moment to bring my child home and shield her. I walked her the 5 blocks back to my house. Every step felt like it dragged my heart along the ground. She cried quietly. So did I. But I didn't let her see. When we stepped inside, the warmth from the fireplace made her shiver violently. I grabbed the warmest blanket I had and wrapped it around her, then eased her down onto the sofa. The same sofa my late husband used to sit on to read the newspaper. I made a pot of chicken and vegetable soup, the thing I always cooked whenever she got sick. Samira could only manage a few spoonfuls before she fell asleep, so exhausted she couldn't fight it anymore. I sat there, watching her for a long time. The girl who had once dreamed of a peaceful family was now lying here, torn apart and desperate, stripped of everything by the very man who had sworn to love her. Then the anger started to rise. Not the kind of anger that explodes and burns out quickly, but a deep, heavy rage, like a fire that had been smoldering in my chest for years without me knowing it. And as I watched Samira sleep, I understood that this time I could not stand back and do nothing. Not after what I had just witnessed. I had to do something. I had to confront that man. I had to reclaim what he had stolen from my daughter. I made myself a cup of tea to stay awake. While the night outside was still pitch black, my mind began weaving together a plan, not a violent plan, a plan of dignity, of justice, of a mother's love, the kind of love Deshaun Merrick had never given Samira. By 3 a.m, I was holding my phone, looking up the address of the new apartment where he was living with his mistress. A luxury building, a lavish life that didn't belong to him, a place where he was sleeping peacefully, while my daughter had just slept on the street. But his peaceful sleep was about to end, because I, Rochelle Underwood, am not the kind of woman who lets something like this happen and simply walks away. If you've listened this far, thank you. But this story is only just beginning. And what happens next, when I face Deshaun for the first time, is far more cruel and shocking. If you want to follow the entire journey of how I bring my daughter back from the edge, make sure to like this video, subscribe channel. That night, as I sat beside my daughter who had fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would go find him. I didn't know exactly what I would say or what I would do when he opened the door. But I knew one thing. Deshaun Merrick would never forget what was about to happen. But before facing him, I needed to understand, to truly understand, what my daughter had been through. And I needed to answer the question I had been avoiding for the last 2 years. How did I lose my girl this badly? I sat down in the oak armchair, Marcus's birthday gift to me on my 40th. It's been 8 years since he died from that sudden heart attack. 8 years of learning how to live without him and learning how to be both father and mother to Samira. But maybe I had failed. My eyes landed on the bookshelf by the fireplace where I kept our family photos. I stood up and reached for an old frame, the corners of the photo slightly yellowed with time. It was Samira's high school graduation day. She stood in the middle, wearing a navy blue gown, holding her diploma, her smile so bright it could have lit up the whole room. I was on her left, Marcus on her right. We were so proud words didn't even begin to cover it. "Mama," Samira had once said in that excited voice, "I'm going to be a good nurse. I'm going to take care of people the way you take care of me and Dad." My chest tightened as that memory rushed back. I set the picture down and picked up another one, the wedding photo of Samira and Deshaun. Looking at it now, I could see the signs I had either chosen to ignore or just hadn't had the courage to face. Samira in her simple white wedding dress, gently beautiful, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. There was hesitation there, a quiet kind of fear that I hadn't recognized at the time. And Deshaun, he stood next to her with a confident smile, his hand on her waist just a bit too tight, as if he possessed my daughter rather than loved her. "Why didn't I see that?" I whispered. "Why didn't I stop her?" But I did try. God knows, I tried. There are nights when I ask myself if that day, had I spoken just a little more firmly, stood my ground just a little more, would Samira's life be different? Sometimes a single small decision can save an entire life. And tonight, seeing my girl curled up asleep on my sofa, I knew the silence I had once chosen had to end. 3 days before the wedding, Samira came over looking tense. We sat in my small kitchen, the same kitchen that had witnessed hundreds of mother-daughter conversations. "Baby, I want to talk to you about Deshaun," I began gently. Samira immediately tensed up. "You're starting again." "That's not it, honey." I tried to keep my voice calm. "I just feel like something isn't right. The way he talks to you, the way he always wants to know where you are, who you're with. The way he loves me, you mean?" Samira cut in, her tone sharp. "You don't understand. Deshaun just wants to protect me." "Caring and controlling are two completely different things, Samira." Samira shot to her feet, eyes reddening. "You're always like this. No one's ever good enough for me. But I'm not a child. I'm 28. I have the right to choose my own life." "You're right," I sighed. "You do have that right. But I also have the right to worry when I see you're not safe." "I am safe," Samira said, but her voice trembled. "Deshaun will take care of me." Then she walked out of that kitchen, out of this house, and over the next 2 years, slowly walked out of my life. I wiped my tears and gently set the wedding photo down as if I was afraid it would break. "Why didn't you listen to me, baby?" Or, "Why didn't I try harder? Why did I use respecting your decision as an excuse to stand on the sidelines when you needed me most?" I walked to the window. Snow was falling, blanketing North Minneapolis in white. Under the pale yellow streetlights, each snowflake fell like a tear from the sky. I thought of Marcus. What would he say if he were here? "Ro." I could almost hear his voice in my mind. "Stop blaming yourself. What happened to her is not your fault. And now, you have to stand firm. She needs you." "You're right," I whispered into the darkness. "She needs me. And this time, I won't let her walk alone." I turned back toward the chair, but I didn't sit down. Instead, I went to the small table, opened the drawer, and took out an old tin box. Inside were the things I had kept from Samira's marriage, the marriage certificate, a few photos, and most importantly, a copy of the house purchase contract. I remembered clearly the day Samira had proudly told me, "Mama, Deshaun and I just bought our first house. It's small in Bryant, but it's ours." I had asked, "Whose names are on the contract?" Samira had answered instantly, "Both of ours, of course. We bought it together." But now, looking at the paperwork, there was only one name, Samira Underwood. My heart began to pound. What did that mean? I folded the document and slipped it into an envelope. This was definitely an important link. The clock read 4 in the morning. I knew I should sleep. But how could I when 1,000 questions were stampeding through my mind? I walked into the spare bedroom, the room that had once been Samira's. I had kept everything just the way it was all these years. The small bed with its floral sheets, the bookshelf full of medical textbooks, the desk lined with certificates and awards. I sat down on the bed and smoothed my hand over the familiar blanket. "I'm going to bring you back to this home, baby," I whispered. "I promise." And in that very moment, in the middle of the freezing winter night, something inside me shifted. Not just anger, not just pain. It was purpose. I wasn't just going to make Deshaun Merrick pay for what he had done. I was going to rebuild my daughter's life, piece by piece, step by step, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. I jolted awake closer to 9 a.m. my neck stiff, my knees aching from kneeling the night before. Samira was still on the sofa, curled under the blanket, sleeping deeply. But at least, for the first time in months, she was sleeping somewhere warm and safe. In the morning light, I saw everything clearly. Sunken cheeks, cracked lips, jawbones jutting sharply, bruises on her wrists and arms. My daughter looked as if she'd been broken under the hands of a cruel man. I backed into the kitchen, clinging to familiar motions so I wouldn't fall apart, brewing coffee, frying eggs, toasting bread, cooking sausage, squeezing orange juice. After a while, Samira woke up. "Morning, baby. I made breakfast. Want some coffee?" She nodded slightly. I poured it exactly the way she'd liked it since high school. Little sugar, lots of cream. We sat across from each other in silence for a while. Samira ate very slowly, tiny bites. Then she set her fork down. "You want to know what happened, don't you?" "Only when you're ready," I said. Samira took a deep breath. "This didn't happen overnight, Mama. It came little by little until I couldn't recognize who I was anymore." She told me, at first, Deshaun was attentive, picking her up from work, cooking meals, telling her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. After the wedding, he texted constantly, monitored her every move. If she replied late, he blew up, accused her of hiding things. Then he started criticizing her nursing job, saying the uniform was too revealing, that men at the hospital were looking at her the wrong way. He cried and said, "I'm just scared of losing you." And in the end, she quit her job, thinking that was love, that it was sacrifice for their family. After that, he began cutting off her friends, saying they were jealous of their happiness. Then it was my turn. "What did he say about me?" I asked. "He said you were toxic, that you didn't want me happy, that you wanted to keep me for yourself after Dad died." I turned away so she wouldn't see my face at that moment. And I believed him. "I'm sorry, Mama." Samira broke into tears. I knelt down in front of her. "Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. He manipulated you. That is not your fault." Then she told me about the house in Bryant. At first, it was their house. 6 months ago, he went into a rage, demanded that the deed be transferred to his name only, saying it was to protect their assets. He slammed the table, punched walls. She was so scared she signed the papers. A month later, she discovered he had already sold the house when the new owner came knocking with documents, telling her to move out. And him? He moved in with her, with Tiana. He used the money from the sale to buy that condo at Stone Arch River Residences. That man moved into a luxury apartment, and my daughter was thrown out onto the street. Where did you stay after that? At first I crashed with friends, but I had no money, no job. I was ashamed, too ashamed to come home to you. He kept drilling it into my head that I was a burden, that if I went back, I'd ruin your life. I pulled her into my arms and held her tight. Listen to me clearly. You have never been, and will never be, a burden. You are my daughter. No one, not even you, is allowed to call you a burden in my life. We held each other and cried, two women who had lost far too much, but were still clinging to each other to stand up again. When Samira finally calmed down, she asked, "What are you going to do, Mom?" I wiped my tears and looked straight into her eyes. "I'm going to get justice for you. I'm going to make sure Deshaun Merrick pays for what he's done, and I'm going to do everything in my power so you never have to live in fear again." "He's dangerous, Mom." "Baby," I pressed my lips together and gave a cold smile. "He's never had to face a mother who's lost her daughter for 2 long years. He has no idea what I'm capable of." In the morning light pouring into that little kitchen, I knew, from that moment on, I would not stop until justice came knocking on Deshaun Merrick's door. After Samira went into the bathroom, nearly 40 minutes to wash away the dirt and at least some of the horror clinging to her body, I sat down at the dining table, staring at my old phone. I needed help. Not because I was weak, but because I knew. If I wanted to fight someone like Deshaun within this legal system, I needed someone who understood the law better than I did, standing on my side. I needed Leroy Daniels. I met Leroy more than 30 years ago when I was working at Hennepin County Medical Center, and he was a clerk for a small law firm. We met at a fundraiser in North Minneapolis. Marcus, my husband at the time, and Leroy quickly became close friends. When Marcus died from that sudden heart attack, Leroy was one of the first to show up, helping me with legal paperwork, guiding me through those first dark days. Now, Leroy is a well-known attorney in Minneapolis, with an office on Nicollet Mall, specializing in asset fraud and domestic violence. Exactly the kind of person I needed. I dialed his number, my hand trembling slightly. After 3 rings, that deep, warm voice came through. "Rochelle? What's going on?" "Leroy." I swallowed hard. "I need you." A few seconds of silence, then his voice turned serious. "I'll be right there." 30 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Leroy, a black man around 58, graying hair, neat gray suit, a worn leather briefcase in hand, stood on my doorstep. "Rochelle." He pulled me into a tight hug. "What's happening? I've never heard your voice sound like it did this morning." I just shook my head and led him into the living room. Samira had finished showering and was wearing a loose sweater and joggers. She was clean now, but she looked smaller somehow inside those clothes, her hair still damp, her face pale with exhaustion. Leroy stopped short when he saw her. "Samira? Good Lord, are you okay?" Samira dropped her gaze, unable to look up. He turned to me, eyes full of questions. "Sit down, Leroy," I said. "Let me tell it from the beginning." And I did. About the freezing sidewalk. About how I found Samira curled up between 2 cardboard boxes. About the bruises on her body. About everything she'd said that morning. About Deshaun Merrick. And how he stripped my girl of everything. Leroy listened in silence, occasionally jotting notes, his jaw clenched tight. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "Rochelle, you know this is going to be a very complicated case, right?" "I know," I replied, "but complicated doesn't mean impossible." "He covered his tracks well," Leroy explained. "If, when the house was sold, the paperwork only had his name on it, on the surface, everything will look legal." "But my daughter was tricked into signing those papers," I said. "And we can prove he abused and manipulated her." Leroy nodded. "Right. If we can prove coercion through threats and psychological abuse, we can sue for fraud and asset misappropriation." He pulled out his notebook and pen. "But to do that, we need evidence. We need witnesses. We need anything we can use to pin him down in court." I stood up and grabbed the envelope I had already prepared. "This is a copy of the house purchase contract. At first, it had Samira's name on it. Later, I believe he manipulated her into signing a transfer." Leroy went through each page carefully, then nodded. "Good. This is our first piece of evidence. What else do we have?" I looked over at Samira. "Do you still have anything? Texts, emails, documents? Anything from Deshaun?" Samira was silent for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I still have an old phone. I hid it. He doesn't know. There are some texts in there, and a few recordings." Both Leroy and I looked up. "Recordings?" Leroy's voice was low, but there was a spark of hope in it. Samira nodded again. "One time, he threatened me. He said if I dared tell anyone about the house, he'd make me disappear. I was scared, so I hit record. I thought, if something ever happened to me, at least there would be proof." Leroy and I looked at each other. We both knew we had just touched on a crucial piece of the puzzle. "Samira, can you get that phone for me?" Samira went into the room and came back a moment later with an old iPhone, the screen cracked but still working. She handed it to Leroy. He unlocked it and scrolled through the text messages, full of curses, insults, words no one should ever have to hear from their spouse. Then he opened the recordings. Deshaun's voice came through, cold and full of rage. "Who do you think you are? You think you can leave me? I gave you everything. The house, the life, everything. You're nothing, Samira. If you tell anyone about this, I'll make you regret it. You hear me?" Samira's voice trembling. "Please don't. I just want to—" "You're nothing but trash, a burden. Your mama thinks the same. She just doesn't say it. I'm the only one who puts up with you, and this is how you repay me?" Leroy stopped the recording. His face had gone pale. The room fell silent. "Dear God," he murmured. I clenched my hands so tightly, my nails dug into my skin, and I didn't even feel it. "How many recordings like this do you have?" Leroy asked. 7, Samira replied. "From the 3 months before he kicked me out." Leroy quickly wrote that down. "Good. Combined with the house contract, the text messages, and these 7 recordings, we have enough grounds to sue him for fraud, asset misappropriation, and psychological abuse." He turned to me. "But Rochelle, you have to be prepared. This is going to be a long fight. He'll hire lawyers, he'll deny everything, and the legal system is not always on the side of people like us." "I know," I said slowly, "but I don't care. I'll fight. No matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs." The corner of Leroy's mouth lifted slightly. "I knew you'd say that, and I'll stand with you." He rolled his sleeves up just a little, a small gesture, but enough for me to understand. The battle had officially begun. "First step," Leroy continued, slipping back into his work tone, "is to gather more evidence, witnesses, anyone who's ever seen him mistreat Samira, neighbors, friends, co-workers." He turned to Samira. "Do you remember anyone who witnessed something?" Samira nodded. "There's a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door to the house in Bryant. She once asked if I was okay. There was a time when Deshawn shoved me in the yard and she saw it." Leroy wrote it down immediately. "Good. We'll go talk to her. Anyone else?" "There's an old co-worker, Janice. We worked together at the hospital. I told her about what was happening at home." "Perfect. We'll get in touch with her too." He turned back to me. "Rochelle, we also have to investigate Deshawn's assets, the new condo, bank accounts, real estate transactions. If we can prove the money from the house sale was used to buy this condo at Stone Arch River Residences, we'll have a huge advantage." "How are we going to investigate that?" I asked. Leroy gave a thin smile. "Leave that to me. I've got a few connections. I know which doors to knock on first." He checked the time. "It's almost 11. I need to get back to the office to prepare documents, draft motions, and check the housing transactions. As for you, stay home and take care of Samira. Make sure she eats, rests. When we're in court, we need her strong." I nodded. "Thank you, Leroy." He put a hand on my shoulder. "Marcus was my brother. Samira is my niece. I'm not going to let that man live comfortably in a condo paid for by the sale of the house while she once had to sleep on the street." He turned to Samira. "Samira, what he did to you was a crime. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure he pays, but you have to trust your mother. Trust me. Deal?" Samira nodded, her eyes filling again. "Thank you, Uncle Leroy." Leroy gave her a warm smile, said goodbye to us, and left. The door closed. The house fell quiet again, but this time it was no longer the silence of despair. It was the silence before a battle that had finally been named. I turned to my daughter. "Everything's going to be okay, baby," I said softly. "We're going to get through this, not alone, but together." And for the first time in a very long while, in Samira's eyes, beneath all the layers of fear and guilt, I saw a tiny glimmer of hope. Just a small one, but enough for me to know, from this moment on, we had truly begun the journey of taking her life back. 2 days after our first working session with Leroy, I got a call from him. "Rochelle, I found Mrs. Patterson's address. She's still in Bryant, just a few houses down from Samira's old place." "Good," I replied, my heart tightening slightly. "When should we go see her?" "Today, if you can manage it. The sooner the better." I glanced over at Samira. She was sitting on the sofa, a book open in her hands, but I knew her eyes weren't holding on to a single line. Her mind was still trapped somewhere inside the months she'd just survived. "Samira," I called gently, "Uncle Leroy wants me to go see Mrs. Patterson. Do you want to come with us?" She hesitated. I'm not sure, Mom. I'm scared if I go back there." "It's okay." I moved closer, speaking as softly as I could. "You don't have to force yourself. You stay home and rest. Uncle Leroy and I will go." Samira looked at me, a flicker of relief mixed with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. An hour later, Leroy picked me up in his old sedan. We drove through the familiar streets of Minneapolis, heading from North Minneapolis down to Bryant, where the small wooden houses stood, with white fences and front lawns faded by snow and cold. When the car stopped in front of Mrs. Patterson's house, my heart began to beat faster. I didn't know what she would say. I didn't know if she'd be willing to step into this fight with us. Leroy and I walked up onto the porch, and he knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. A white woman around 70, short silver hair, thick sweater, looked at us with cautious eyes. "Yes?" she asked. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson," Leroy said, polite and professional. "I'm attorney Leroy Daniels, and this is Mrs. Rochelle Underwood. We're here to ask about her daughter, Samira." Her expression changed immediately. The suspicion vanished, replaced by alarm and concern. "Samira?" she gasped. "Oh my God. Is she all right? I haven't seen her in months." I stepped forward. "Mrs. Patterson, my daughter has been through something terrible, and right now, we need your help." She looked at me, then at Leroy, thinking for a brief moment, and then opened the door wider. "Come in. We'll talk inside." We sat in her small, warm living room, walls lined with family photos, an old wooden shelf, and the faint smell of freshly baked apple pie lingering in the air. Mrs. Patterson poured us tea and sat down in the chair across from us, both hands wrapped around her cup as if she needed the extra warmth to face what she was about to hear. "You go ahead," she said. "Where is Samira? Is she all right?" I took a deep breath. "Mrs. Patterson, my daughter was psychologically abused by her ex-husband, by Deshaun Merrick, for a long time. Then he threw her out of the house. Samira has been homeless for months. A few days ago, I finally found her." Her hands froze around the cup. She covered her mouth with one hand, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh my God. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't think it was this bad." Leroy gently set a small notebook on the table, pen ready. "Mrs. Patterson, if you're willing, we'd like to ask you to tell us everything you've seen about how Deshaun treated Samira. Any detail you can remember is important." She nodded, swallowed hard, as if gathering her memories into order. "I remember very clearly," she began. "They moved in about 2 years ago. At first they seemed like a normal young couple, smiling, greeting the neighbors, but just a few months later, things started to change. I heard raised voices from that house more and more often. At first it was arguments, then it turned into the sound of things being slammed and broken." She paused for a moment, breathing deeper. "One night, I remember it clearly, sometime in August last year, I heard a scream from the backyard. I looked out my window and saw Deshaun yelling at Samira. He shoved her, hard enough that she fell down the steps." "Oh, God," I whispered, my fingers clutching the edge of my sleeve. "I ran outside," Mrs. Patterson continued. "I asked if she was okay, but Deshaun immediately stepped in, said it was a family matter, and told me not to interfere. Samira, she just got up, wiped her tears, and told me she was fine." "But you knew that wasn't fine, did you?" Leroy asked, his voice low but gentle. "Of course not." She shook her head. "I saw the fear in her eyes. I called the police. But when they showed up, Samira told them it was just a small argument. And Deshaun, he acted like a perfect gentleman. He told the officers everything was resolved, just a misunderstanding. She turned to me, her eyes full of guilt. I'm sorry, I should have done more. No, I shook my head, my voice rough. You tried to help her, and right now you're helping us by saying all of this. Mrs. Patterson nodded, this time more firmly, as if she'd just made a decision for herself as well. If my testimony can help Samira, I'll do it. I'll do whatever I can. Leroy wrote down every detail, every time frame, then handed her a piece of paper and a pen. Please write down everything you remember, dates, circumstances, specific details. And if there's anyone else in this neighborhood who might have seen similar incidents, we'd be grateful if you'd tell us. There's someone else, she said immediately. Mr. Chen, he lives across the street. I know he's seen Deshawn yelling at Samira at least twice in front of the house. He once told me there's something very wrong with that man. Thank you. That's very important information, Leroy said. We'll get in touch with him. As we stood up to leave, Mrs. Patterson took my hand. Her hand was thin, but her grip was strong. Please, tell Samira I'm so sorry, and that I'm very glad she finally made it back to her mother. I nodded, my throat so tight I couldn't form a full sentence. All I could do was squeeze her hand in return. Outside Mrs. Patterson's house, I stood on the Bryant sidewalk for a moment, looking toward the old house where my daughter had once lived. Every step, every window looked like it held all the things I hadn't seen in time. Leroy opened the car door for me, waited until I'd settled in, then got behind the wheel. We drove in silence for a while. Only the engine and the wind against the windows filled the space between us. On the outside, everything can look fine. A cute little house, a freshly painted white fence, a young couple waving hello to the neighbors every morning. But sometimes, just one thin wall away, there are sounds of breaking. Words of humiliation no one hears, shoves and blows that the person inside is forced to call just a misunderstanding. If you've ever looked at a closed door and felt in your gut that something wasn't right, remember Samira. And keep following this story, because what happens after today's visit is going to lead us straight to the front door of Deshawn Merrick. On the way back, Leroy was the one who broke the silence first. We did good today, Rochelle, he said, eyes still on the road. Piece by piece, we're building the full picture. But will all that be enough? I asked, unable to hide the worry in my voice. Enough to stand up to him? Enough to make him really pay? Leroy thought for a moment before answering. With what we have now, recordings, texts, the house contract, Mrs. Patterson's testimony, and possibly Mr. Chen's, we're no longer empty-handed. We have a chance, but we're still missing one thing. What else do I have to do? I asked immediately. We need him to show his true face, Leroy said slowly. We need him to say things no lawyer can erase. The best way to do that is for you to confront him. I turned to look at him. Confront him? You mean, I go see him? Talk to him? That's right. You're Samira's mother. You have the right to ask him. Why? You have the right to demand answers. And if we prepare well, recording, witnesses on standby, a clear plan, he might expose his true nature right in front of you. The thought of standing face to face with the man who destroyed my daughter's life knotted my stomach. The rational part of me knew Leroy was right, but the mother in me, the part that had knelt on the sidewalk holding her shaking child, wanted to tear everything apart. I stayed quiet for a while, watching the bare trees along the road slide past us. All right, I said at last. I'll see him. Leroy nodded, as if he'd already known my answer. But you're not going to do it alone, he said. I'll be there with you, and we'll have a clear plan before you ever press that doorbell. I leaned back against the seat and took a deep breath. Deshawn Merrick might have thought that kicking my daughter out onto the street was the end of it, that Samira would disappear like a shadow in the Minneapolis winter. But he forgot one thing. She still has a mother. And this time, I'm going to knock on his door, not just as a grieving mother, but as the one who's going to drag him into the light. I spent the whole night doing nothing but breathing and bracing myself. Leroy had laid out a very clear plan. We would go to Deshawn's condo in the afternoon, right around the time he usually came home. Leroy would wait in the lobby, and I would be the one to knock on his door. "Remember this, Rochelle," he warned me over the phone. "You're not going there to argue. You're going there to get the truth. Stay calm. Don't let him drag you into a shouting match. Your phone is already set to record everything." "All right," I said. But I knew deep down, to me, this wasn't just about getting evidence. This would be the first time I stood in front of the man who crushed my daughter, and the moment he would realize the game was over. Around 3 p.m. the next day, Leroy came to pick me up. We left North Minneapolis behind, the old houses with peeling paint, the freezing bus stops, and drove into the polished Mill District. Glass towers, luxury cars, people in suits crossing the street like they were born to belong here. Stone Arch River residences came into view, glass facade reflecting the gray sky and the distant river, a grand lobby with crystal chandeliers, thick carpets, manicured plants. The security guard here looked more like a 5-star hotel concierge than a guard. "This is where he lives," I said quietly, eyes fixed on the windows. "Paid for with my daughter's money." Leroy put a hand on my shoulder. "Steady, Rochelle. We're here to claim justice, step by step, no rush, no losing control." We walked into the lobby. The white guard in his 30s looked at us with that polite, icy kind of courtesy I know all too well. The kind of gaze that says a middle-aged black woman doesn't quite belong in a place like this. "How can I help you two?" "I'm here to see Deshawn Merrick, apartment 12B, I said, keeping my voice even. "May I have your name, ma'am?" "Rochelle Underwood." "Do you have an appointment with him?" "No, but I'm his ex-wife's mother. I need to speak with him about an important family matter." He hesitated, then picked up the phone and called upstairs. Every second of that wait felt like it weighed 100 pounds. I had no idea whether Deshawn would tell him to let me up or have us thrown out. Finally, the guard hung up. "Mr. Merrick says you may go up. Apartment 12B, 12th floor." "Thank you." Leroy gave my hand a quick, firm squeeze in front of the elevator. "I'll be right here. Your phone is recording. If anything feels off, call me immediately. Don't try to handle it alone." I nodded and stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, swallowing all the sounds from the lobby. It was just me now, 4 mirrored walls, and the sound of my own heartbeat. In the reflection stood a 62-year-old woman in an old coat, gray threading through her hair, wrinkles around her eyes. But in those eyes was the fire of a mother who had once lost her child, and this time refused to lose her again. "You will have justice, Samira," I whispered. "I promise." The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto the 12th floor. The hallway was carpeted in gray, with light-colored walls and warm yellow lights. The smell of new wood and expensive cologne hung in the air, as if mocking the months my daughter had spent curled up on the street. 12B was at the end of the hallway. I stopped in front of the door, took a deep breath, and knocked 3 times, firmly. A few seconds later, the door opened. Deshawn Merrick. Tall, broad shoulders, brown skin, clean-shaven, wearing a white t-shirt and expensive joggers, a flashy watch on his wrist. For a split second, I saw surprise on his face. Then it shifted quickly into irritation. "Mrs. Underwood," he said coldly, "didn't think I'd ever see you here." "I need to talk to you," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "About Samira." He let out a short, mocking laugh. "Samira? We're divorced. She's got nothing to do with me anymore." "But she's still my daughter, and what you did to her has everything to do with me." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over his chest. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" "I'm not accusing you. I'm repeating the facts," I said slowly. "You sold the house my daughter helped buy, threw her out with nothing, left her to sleep on the street in freezing weather, while you live here in this fancy condo." His face stayed stone cold. "Samira is a grown woman. She's responsible for her own life. If she failed, that's on her, not me. The anger surged up in my chest, but I remembered Leroy's words. I wasn't here to scream at him. You tricked my daughter into signing the transfer papers, I continued. You threatened her, used psychological abuse to force her to sign. Then you sold the house and used the money to buy this condo for yourself and that other woman. Deshawn laughed, louder this time. You don't have a shred of proof. Samira signed everything willingly. The house was legally mine, and this so-called emotional abuse, he made air quotes, is just some story she made up so she doesn't have to take responsibility for her own mess. I do have proof, I replied, looking him straight in the eye. Texts, recordings, your voice, calling my daughter a burden, threatening to make her disappear if she ever told the truth. For the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. You're just making things up. You've got nothing on me. Oh, I have more than you think, I said, my voice dropping lower. And I'm going to hand all of it to the court, to the police, to anyone who needs to see who you really are. Deshawn Merrick, not the successful man you like to present, but a coward who builds his life by destroying the women who trust him. His jaw clenched. You'd better watch what you're saying. This is slander. No, this is me repeating your own words from those recordings. He stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. You need to leave, now, before I call security and have them throw you out of this building. I'll go, I said, but before I do, there's one thing you need to understand. I lifted my chin and met his gaze head on. You think you've destroyed my daughter. You think you won when you pushed her into the street. But you're wrong. Samira is stronger than you think. And I, her mother, will not stop until you pay for every bruise, every night she lay shivering on that sidewalk. He growled back. You can't touch me. I have lawyers. I have money. And who are you? Just some old lady from North Minneapolis who thinks she can fight me? I didn't back down an inch. That's right. I'm just an old mother from a neighborhood you wouldn't even bother driving through. But don't you ever underestimate a woman who has already lost her child once and just found her again on a frozen sidewalk. I turned and walked away. I'll see you in court, I said, without even looking back. The door slammed behind me. Before the elevator doors closed, I heard a woman's voice drift out from inside the condo. Babe, what was that? Tiana, the pregnant woman sleeping peacefully in a condo bought with the money from the house my daughter once called home. I stepped into the elevator, the corner of my mouth curling into the thinnest smile. The next step in the plan was clear, not just facing Deshawn, but talking to Tiana. If this is the first time you've seen a man like Deshawn, you might be thinking, he's just a lousy, selfish guy. But manipulators rarely act alone. They almost always have an audience by their side, another woman who believes she's the exception, the fresh start. In the next part, we'll see what happens when a mother seeks out the other woman, not to pick a fight, but to drag every secret hiding under that expensive rug out into the light. I didn't tell Leroy about my plan to meet Tiana, not because I didn't trust him, but because I already knew what he'd say. Let the law handle it. Don't step into their private life. But for me, this wasn't just about the law. This was my way of trying to pull another woman back from the exact same pit my daughter had just crawled out of. That night, after Samira finally fell asleep, I opened her old laptop and typed into Google, Tiana Fairfax, Minneapolis. A few results popped up: LinkedIn, a charity event article, and Facebook. On Facebook, I saw photos of Tiana and Deshawn in fancy restaurants, Tiana visibly pregnant, the caption, blessed and grateful, with little heart emojis. Looking at those pictures, I didn't feel hatred. I felt pity, because I knew all too well that this soft, tender phase was just the opening act in a brutal cycle. The moment he got bored, she would become the next Samira. Then I noticed something important. Tiana checked in at a cafe called Brew and Soul Coffee most Wednesday mornings around 10. That day was Tuesday. Tomorrow, I would be there. Wednesday morning, I left a note for Samira. Mom's going to take care of something. I'll be back before noon. Remember to eat breakfast. Love you. I put on a navy sweater, khaki pants, my winter coat, and took the bus to the Mill District. Bruin Soul was small and warm, rich with the smell of coffee and pastries. I ordered a black coffee and sat in a corner facing the door. At 10:05, Tiana walked in, just like in the photos. Young, light brown skin, beige coat, a pregnancy bump 6 or 7 months along. She ordered herbal tea and sat by the window. She looked more tired and worried than happy. I picked up my coffee and walked over. "Excuse me, are you Tiana Fairfax?" She looked up, surprised. "Yes. Do I know you?" "I'm Rochelle Underwood, Samira's mother." Her face changed instantly, tightening with anxiety. What are you doing here?" "I just want to talk," I said. "No blame, no drama, just a few minutes. If you want me to leave, I'll leave." Tiana glanced around, then sighed. "All right, but only 5 minutes." I sat down. We stayed silent for a moment. "Tiana, I didn't come here to hate you," I began. "You're not the one who destroyed Samira's marriage. That person is Deshawn." She stared at me, confused. You don't hate me?" "No, I feel sorry for you, because you're standing exactly where my daughter once stood." Tiana lowered her head, one hand wrapping around her belly. "I don't understand what you're trying to say." "What did Deshawn tell you about Samira?" "He said Samira was a bad wife, that she never supported him, that she had mental issues." I nodded. "And you believed him?" "Why shouldn't I?" she shot back, but her voice was shaky. "He's been kind. He takes care of me, looks after me and the baby." "He used to be exactly like that with Samira," I said slowly. "Right up until the day he sold the house she helped pay for, took the money to move into that condo with you, and threw my daughter into the street." Tiana's face went pale. "No, that can't be." I took Samira's phone out and laid it on the table. In here, there are texts and recordings. His voice, insulting her, threatening her. If you want, you can listen. Tiana stared at the phone, her fingers squeezing her teacup. "I'm scared. If I listen, everything will fall apart." "I understand," I said, "but finding out early is still less devastating than learning the truth when you've already lost everything." At some point, she started crying without realizing it. "He doesn't like it when I visit my mother either," she whispered. "He says she has a bad influence on me. He gets angry if I don't answer the phone right away, if I want to see my friends. He says it's only because he worries about me." "That's not worry," I answered. "That's control. The first step is always to pull you away from the people who truly love you." Tiana placed both hands over her belly, her voice trembling. "But I'm pregnant. I quit my job like he asked. I have no money of my own. How am I supposed to leave?" Exactly like Samira, I thought. If you've listened this far, you'll notice the pattern. At first he's just protective. He checks your phone because he cares. Then slowly, he doesn't like your friends. He doesn't want you visiting your mother. He doesn't want you working. By the time you finally realize what's happening, everything, money, housing, relationships, is already in his hands. In the next part, Tiana's choice is the turning point. Will she continue to believe the story Deshawn has crafted? Or will she look straight at the truth and protect herself and her baby? Don't go anywhere, because this is the moment where the cycle of abuse might finally be cut. I cleared my throat and asked, "Tiana, do you still have family in Minneapolis?" "Yes, my mother, but we barely talk. He says she's controlling and makes me too emotional." "Call your mother," I said. "She still loves you, even if things are strained, and she will help you. Don't let him cut you off from the one person who will always be on your side." "And him," Tiana whispered. "If he finds out I met you." "You don't have to face him alone. If you need to, call me. Or call a lawyer. Leroy Daniels. He's helping Samira, and he can help you build a safety plan too. Housing, finances, legal protection. The most important thing is keeping you and the baby safe. A small spark of hope lit up in Tiana's eyes. Do you really think I could leave him? I know you can, I said. My daughter survived being thrown out into the cold. You have your mother, your baby, and the chance to leave before it gets that far. You're not as alone as she was. I wrote my number and Leroy's on a small piece of paper and slid it toward her. This is my number, and this is attorney Leroy Daniels. Whenever you need us, day or night, call. Tiana gripped that paper like a lifeline. Thank you. Really, thank you. I stood up to go, then paused. One more thing, Tiana. Be very careful. If Deshaun finds out we met, he may explode. Don't tell him anything yet. Only talk to people you trust completely. Your mother and Leroy if you want to, until you have a safe plan in place. She nodded, arms wrapped around her belly like she was holding on to a new kind of resolve. When I stepped out of the cafe, the snow on the sidewalks had begun to melt. The sky was brighter. I knew this wasn't over, but at least today I had reached out and grabbed another woman's hand before she was thrown into the same abyss as my daughter. I didn't expect things to escalate this fast. 2 days after my meeting with Tiana, the phone rang. It was Leroy. I could tell just from his tone that something was wrong. Rochelle, we've got a problem, he said bluntly. What is it? Deshaun just filed a countersuit against Samira. Defamation, slander, attempted extortion. He claims Samira made everything up to squeeze money from him. I almost shouted into the phone. That's ridiculous. We have evidence. I know, Leroy said calmly. This is strategy. He's trying to scare her, to pressure her into backing down. And there's more. He hired Edward Krantz, one of the toughest divorce and property dispute lawyers in Minneapolis. He's not playing around. I dropped into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. So what do we do now? We fight, Leroy replied simply. We have documents, recordings, witnesses, and we may be about to have one more. Who? Tiana Fairfax. She just called me. She wants to meet, and she's willing to give us information on Deshaun. A spark of hope flickered in the middle of the storm. That afternoon, Leroy drove me to a small cafe far from the Mill District, the kind of place Deshaun would never just happen to visit. Tiana was already there, in an oversized hoodie, hair tied back, no makeup. She looked exhausted and tense, but in her eyes I saw something that reminded me of the first day I found Samira on the street, the stubborn determination to survive. Thank you for coming, she said softly. Tiana, this is attorney Leroy Daniels, I introduced. Leroy shook her hand. I know this wasn't an easy decision. Thank you for calling. Tiana took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the cup of tea in front of her. Since I met you, I haven't been able to sleep, she said. I started noticing things, the way he talks, how he dodges every time I ask about his past. Yesterday I casually asked about the old house, the one he lived in with Samira. Just out of curiosity, he exploded. She swallowed hard, fingers twisting together. He yelled at me, said it wasn't my business, said I should know my place. Then he slammed his hand on the table so hard the coffee cup fell and shattered. The look in his eyes, she shuddered, like he was staring at an enemy. I placed my hand on her forearm and squeezed gently. You're not crazy, I said. You're just finally seeing who he really is. I know I have to leave him, Tiana said, eyes red. But I'm pregnant. I don't work. I have no money of my own. All the accounts are in his name. Exactly like Samira, Leroy muttered. Classic control pattern. I leaned in toward her. Do you still have family in Minneapolis? My mother, but we barely talk. He says she drags down my mood and that it's bad for the pregnancy. I nodded. Call her. Believe me, a mother always waits for her child to come back, no matter how angry she is. Tiana cried, But this time, it was a mix of fear and a strange relief. I'll try. Leroy opened his notebook. Legally, if you're willing to testify to what you've seen and heard, how he talks about Samira, how he controls the money, the house sale, that will help Samira's case a lot. And it will help you too, if you ever need protection later. Tiana looked up, her gaze steadier now. I'll do it. I don't want my child growing up with a father like that, and I don't want Samira being blamed for things he did. You're very brave, Leroy said. Just then, Tiana's phone buzzed. She looked down and went white. It's him. Let it ring, Leroy said immediately. Don't pick up. The phone rang and rang, then stopped. A moment later, a text came through. Tiana opened it, her hands shaking. He says, "Get home now. Don't think you can hide from me. I know exactly what you're doing. You're going to regret this." Leroy frowned. He's tracking you. How could he? Your phone, Leroy said quickly. He could have installed location tracking or has access to your accounts. You need to turn it off, right now. Tiana, panicked, powered the phone down. Where do I go now? She whispered. I didn't have to think. To my house, I said. You can stay with me and Samira, at least for now, until we get things sorted. She stared at me, stunned. But you don't even really know me. I know better than anyone what it feels like to be thrown away, I answered, and I'm not going to let one more woman end up on the street like trash. We left the cafe quickly. Leroy drove, Tiana sat in the back seat, phone off, both hands wrapped around her belly. I sat beside her and held her cold hand. What do you think he'll do? She asked quietly. He'll look for you, I said honestly, but he won't find you. And if he does? Then we call the police, Leroy said from the front. We apply for a restraining order and use those threatening messages as evidence. When we arrived at my house, Samira was on the sofa. The moment she saw Tiana step in, her face froze. Shock, hurt, and old memories crashing into her all at once. That's... Samira began. Tiana, I said gently, and she needs help, just like you did. A silence heavy as lead settled over the living room. Samira stood, looked at Tiana for a long moment, then asked, voice rough but direct, Does he treat you badly too? Tiana broke down, nodding. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know what he'd done to you. To both of you. I know you didn't, Samira said. And then she did the one thing that truly shocked me. She stepped forward and wrapped Tiana in a hug. It's not your fault, she whispered. Two women, both shattered by the same man, clung to each other and sobbed in my small North Minneapolis living room. And in that moment, I understood one thing very clearly. Deshawn could hire the best lawyer, could file countersuits, could send all the threatening messages he wanted, but he would never break what was growing right in front of me, the strength of women who had decided they were done being victims. 3 weeks after that first cafe meeting with Tiana, we had our first day in court. Those 3 weeks were a whirlwind. Deshawn tried everything to find Tiana, calling nonstop, hiring a private investigator, even showing up at her mother's house. But with Leroy's help, we secured a temporary restraining order. Tiana stayed with me during that time. At first, things between her and Samira were tense, a heavy silence between two women wounded by the same man. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard voices from the living room. I peeked out and saw Samira and Tiana sitting side by side on the sofa, talking. He used to say that to me too, Samira was saying, that my mother was toxic, that I should stay away from her. He said the same thing to me, Tiana replied, voice shaking. He told me my family was jealous of how happy we were. That's how he isolates us, Samira said quietly. So we have no one left to run to. They were silent for a moment. Then Tiana asked, Do you hate me? Samira turned to her. No, I used to think I would, but now She paused. Now I just see you as another version of me. Someone who was lied to, manipulated. Tiana started to cry. I'm sorry. I didn't know what he did to you. I know, Samira said. And then she did it again. She hugged Tiana. We're going to get through this. Together. I went back to my room, my heart overflowing. 2 broken women were finding healing in each other. The morning of the hearing, I woke up at 5. I put on my navy suit, smoothed my hair, and wrapped the scarf Marcus once gave me around my neck, so I could feel like he was with me, at least in spirit. Samira got ready carefully too. She wore a simple black dress, hair tied back, minimal makeup. She looked fragile, but there was a resolve in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Tiana didn't come with us. She would appear later, when Leroy called her as a witness. Good luck, she said, hugging Samira. We're going to win. Hennepin County Courthouse, with its tall white columns and long staircases, felt intimidating. My heart pounded as we walked in. Leroy was already waiting in the lobby, gray suit, leather briefcase packed with files. Ready? He asked. Ready, I answered. We walked into the courtroom. A few people were already seated in the gallery, Mrs. Patterson, Janice, and some other witnesses. And on the other side, sitting next to Attorney Edward Krantz, was Deshaun Merrick. He wore a sleek black suit, looking every bit the respectable professional. But when he glanced our way, I saw the cold hatred in his eyes. Samira shrank back slightly. It's all right, I whispered, squeezing her hand. I'm right here. The judge entered, a woman in her mid-50s, face serious and unreadable. She banged the gavel. Court is now in session. The next 2 hours passed like a dream. Mrs. Patterson testified about the night she saw Deshaun shove Samira down the steps. Janice described the time Samira confided in her about a marriage that was slowly killing her. Then it was Samira's turn. She stepped up to the witness stand, hands shaking as she was sworn in. Samira, Leroy began gently, tell the court about your marriage. And she did, from the sweet early days to when everything shifted, to the yelling, the threats, the isolation, to being pressured into signing the house transfer, to being kicked out. How long did you live on the street? Leroy asked. 7 months, Samira whispered, tears streaming down her face. Even Krantz couldn't poke holes in the raw truth of her words. Then came the recordings. Deshaun's voice echoed through the courtroom. You're nothing but trash, Samira. A burden. Your mother thinks the same, she just won't say it out loud. I saw the judge's expression tighten. Finally, Deshaun took the stand. He tried to stay calm, but when the judge pressed him about selling the house without properly notifying Samira, he stumbled. I had the right. Did Ms. Underwood contribute money to the purchase of that property? The judge asked coolly. Yes, but... And did you inform her in good faith that you were selling it? Silence. The judge looked down at the documents for a long moment, then spoke. Based on the evidence, I find that Mr. Deshaun Merrick engaged in fraudulent behavior and wrongful appropriation of assets. I order Mr. Merrick to compensate Ms. Samira Underwood in an amount equivalent to her contribution to the house, plus damages and legal costs. I held my breath. In addition, the judge said, a permanent restraining order is granted. Deshaun shot to his feet, furious, but Krantz pulled him back down. The judge banged the gavel. Court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, under the Minneapolis sun, Samira threw her arms around me and sobbed. Mom, I won. We won, I corrected her. Leroy smiled. You ladies were incredibly brave. And in that moment, I felt a weight I'd been carrying for far too long finally lift. Life changed in ways I never dared dream of. Samira received the settlement and decided to go back to school to become a nurse. She enrolled in a training program, and each day I watched her come home a little more alive. Mom, she said one evening as we sat together, I want to specialize in working with domestic violence survivors. I want to help people like me. I pulled her into a hug, so proud I could barely speak. As for Tiana, she left Deshawn completely. She gave birth to a baby boy, Joshua, and moved in with her mother. She brought him to visit us a week after he was born. "If it hadn't been for you," Tiana said, "I don't know where I'd be." "You saved yourself," I told her. "I just held up a lantern." When the snow started to fall again, soft this time, beautiful instead of cruel, I sat in the living room with Samira beside me. We drank tea, watched a movie, shared a blanket. "Mom," Samira suddenly said, "I want to thank you, not just for saving me, but for never giving up on me." I set my cup down. "Baby, I'm your mother. There is nothing in this world that could make me give up on you. There is no distance too far for me to cross, no darkness too deep for me to bring a light." Samira cried again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "I love you so much, Mom." "I love you too. From the first day I held you in my arms to this moment and for the rest of my life." There are moments in life when you're sure you won't survive, moments when the darkness feels endless and the pain too big to bear, but then, somehow, you realize you are stronger than you think, and real love, healthy love, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. My name is Rochelle Underwood. I'm 62 years old. I live in North Minneapolis, a neighborhood that isn't rich, but it's home. And now, it's also the place where my daughter is slowly rebuilding herself. Our story is not about revenge. It's about survival, about rebuilding, about the power women find when they stand together. If you're in a relationship where you feel afraid, controlled, belittled, please hear me. You are not alone. You deserve love that is safe and kind, not controlling and cruel. And you can leave. No matter how hard it seems, you can. Reach out to someone, a friend, family, a domestic violence hotline, a lawyer, anyone who can help, because your life matters, your future matters. And if you're the mother, father, sibling, or friend of someone in that situation, don't give up on them. Keep knocking on their door. Keep calling. Keep reminding them that you're there, because one day they will need you. I think back to that night, the night I found Samira on the frozen sidewalk, and I ask myself, what if I had walked past without looking closely? I would have lost my child. Forever. But I did look. I stopped. I acted. Let that be a reminder for all of us. Look a little closer. Care a little more. Act when you see someone in trouble, because the person you save might be someone's child, someone's sister, someone's mother. Today, as I sit here with my daughter beside me, with Tiana and little Joshua visiting, with the afternoon light pouring through the window, I feel grateful. Grateful that I didn't give up. Grateful that my daughter was strong enough to survive. Grateful that Tiana was brave enough to leave. And grateful that justice eventually arrived. This is my story. Our story. But it is also the story of countless others fighting through domestic violence and psychological abuse. The message I want to leave you with is this: you are not broken. You are healing. You are not weak. You are resilient. And you are never, ever alone. Before we end, let me ask you something. Have you subscribed to the channel yet? If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button so I know you want to hear more stories like this. Please like this video. It helps me so much in continuing to create. And leave a comment. What do you think about this story? What would you have done in my situation? Tell me which city you're watching from. I love knowing that we're connected, even from far away. Thank you for listening. And thank you for believing that love, persistence, and justice can win. My name is Rochelle Underwood. This was the story of finding my daughter again on a frozen Minneapolis sidewalk, and of never giving up on the people we love. I'll see you in the next story.